Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Terminal Philosophy today, and we are going to start a series on the history of warfare. And the first thing that we need to deal with in this series is define what actually is warfare. Now, oftentimes you'll hear, gangs say, "Well, this is war," or even if somebody's in some sort of vendetta spiral, be like, "This is war." You've brought me to this point. Like in the classic Bugs Bunny cartoon, he's always like, "Of course, this means war," but these are just individuals, right? Or small groups of people, and they may not even be organized. They may be spontaneous, or anything like that. So the definition that I think best includes what we want to include and excludes what we want to exclude is the definition that says war is premeditated, organized, mass conflict. So it's premeditated. So it can't be, manslaughter. It can't be some random act of violence that just happens under some set of conditions. It has to be organized. So it's not like when people, meet up to riot or protest and then it then leads to violence. There might be some that had the intent to start a fight, but it's doubtful that everybody in those groups intended to immediately start fighting. Whereas if you're in armed, organized units with commanders and weapons and tactics and training, you intended to go fighting when you marched out to engage this other body of people. The other issue is then when we look at mass conflict, well, it has to be enough people. So while murder and assassination might be violent, and they might also be premeditated, and they might even be organized in some sense. I mean, the mafia in the 1920s and 30s had a group called Murder Inc. that just hired itself out to whack people. It has to be mass. It has to be large enough. Something like a city-state is a good start. No, I mean, obviously there are non-state actors, nomads, pastoralists, hunter-gatherers, but there has to be the amount of individuals involved in this violent action has to reach a certain threshold whereby it's political now, right? It's political. It's not just some individual or some group of individuals or even some random families having a feud. Like the Hatfields and the McCoys wouldn't really be a war. It's premeditated violence on a somewhat large scale, but you need to have all three of those, and then that would be what I would use as the rubric to determine which kinds of violent engagements are war and which kind are not. So, what do you have to say about this definition for war?
Yeah, I definitely agree. It goes without saying that war requires some specific criteria. However, I think there's a misconception that war somehow requires farming or state formation. And I believe that there's enough archaeological evidence available to suggest that in order to have warfare, you don't technically need organized farming or irrigation systems or even state formation for warfare to take place. I think that's somewhat of a common misconception in archaeology, or at least archaeology enthusiasts seem to think that that is the case. Yeah, war is definitely more or less the result of when political processes break down. That's sort of the next step in political processes, or I should say, after things break down, war will take over. And there's plenty of examples for that. But in prehistory, it was more likely that war was used to compete for resources and territory and hunting territory and water access, whereas later on in the classical period of the kingdoms like Egypt and the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites, that war was a result of political failures and a failure to agree on some sort of territorial hegemony or material access. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, Now, the other aspect that has to be delved into is, of course, when do you want to start studying warfare? Like, for example, in secular literature, the oldest recorded battle is Megiddo between the Egyptians and the Canaanites. If we look at the Bible, the oldest recorded battle would be Abraham versus the four Mesopotamian kings. But I think we can go even further back before we have actual written records. It does make it more difficult, but we do find evidence of warfare. We find the oldest walled city is Jericho, and that goes back to 7,000 BC. Very, very old, and it's walled very early on. We also find settlements on hillocks or mounds, which gives you sort of a high ground. You can sort of see enemies coming in to attack you. Whereas if you were in a more peaceful environment, you wouldn't be so oriented in building your settlements on these elevated areas. We also see large amounts of archaeological evidence of mass graves with traumatic death injuries, which would indicate that these people were killed and then buried there. Now, one interpretation is, well, yeah, these are sacrificial victims. And I'm like, okay, that might be true, but so what? Even a cursory reading of Mexican history will tell you that you had to go to war to get those victims because they're not going to line up and come on their own free will. So when these evidence is trying to explain away, it's like, well, the king, the hieroglyph has the king with a mace or a sword, I know, but that's just a symbol. Well, it is a symbol, but what is it a symbol of? It's a symbol of military prowess. He's able to, bring home the bacon. You can go out there and conquer, kick ass, and take names and make your tribe better. So it is a symbol, but it's not a symbol of some abstract principle. It's a symbol of his ability to exploit his, martial prowess and your tribe's martial prowess over someone else. And so I would argue with the combination of fortified cities that we find in the Stone Age, cities being placed on elevated areas so that they can see who's coming in to get them, and the fact that we find lots of skeletal evidence of brutal head trauma, which lines up very well with damage, that would be inflicted by some sort of edged weapon or blunt weapon or like a spear or an arrow. And the main reason why we even have to make this case is that after World War II, liberal sociologists and historians tried to argue that prior to civilization, prior to farming, everybody was peaceful. Now, by the way, this theory doesn't exist really prior to World War II, because everybody else who does sociology, anthropology, archaeology, it's like, yeah, these are all signs of battle. These are all signs of warfare, written records, archaeological records. It wasn't seriously contested by anybody until around after World War II by Western liberal academics, that the Stone Age was not marked by organized warfare, and that all of these examples of hieroglyphs, petroglyphs, walls, and all these other things were seen for what they were, signs of violent military conflict. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a weird trend that did exist in archaeology, that prehistory was largely peaceful. But again, as more evidence, physical evidence, was acquired over time, I mean, it became clear that this was just a bunch of BS. I mean, for example, 4 very important weapons were found on all major continents without any cultures having contact with each other, and that is the spear, the sling, the bow and arrow, and the atlatl, or the spear thrower, if you want to call it that. These were all made on all of the continents, with the exception of Antarctica, of course. And none of these cultures had contact with each other, and that would suggest, I mean, really, when you just take a step back and you look at this whole archaeological picture from Paleolithic to Neolithic, what you really see is that it should be clear that even though it is a bit of a cliche, that that violence is really intrinsic to human nature and not extrinsic. It's something that's just been a part of us. And again, the liberal academic who might still argue that, oh no, prehistory is still peaceful. Well, just take a moment to reflect on the evidence. And again, some of the earliest evidence that we have for war is on the southern coast of Lake Victoria from about 30,000 BC, with a massacre of mostly male victims with some females. This would suggest some sort of like a like acquiring women for slavery or as wives. And then, of course, you have the Aspern and Schlitz site in Austria, which was another massacre. And there's evidence of fortifications and plenty of evidence for massacres. And a lot of these sites, even with the skull evidence that we have, all of these skulls have blunt force trauma as well as puncture wounds. So yeah, we have to just get rid of the idea that somehow prehistory was somehow peaceful. Along with that, the archaeological professor Robert Carnero of 1970 developed a coercive theory, who goes as far as to say that war helped develop state formation. So I think while you shouldn't necessarily advocate for war as the only way of innovating, war is a way of innovating and pushing innovations within a group of people or a political entity. The archaeologist Brian Fagan states, as well as many other archaeologists, that a third of all deaths in the Neolithic age were violent. So that, again, it's basically a one-sided it's a one-sided case here. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
Well, it's actually interesting too, because I remember when I first started reading history 20, 25 years ago, the Maya and the Minoans, because I guess at the time archaeology it was not as advanced as it is now. They were touted as these societies without war, and we know with the case of the Maya that's patently absurd. With recent archaeological evidence, also we could refer to Spanish accounts when they came to the Americas, that yes, the Maya were proficient in the arts of war. And the Minoans, it's not so much that there's a lot of evidence that's been demonstrated that they were extremely violent per se. It's just that the argument that they did not have any reference to war has been dropped because it just doesn't hold up any water. One of the common arguments was, well, you'll see lots of like sporting events being portrayed or this or that. Yeah, sports are training you for war. Like, was it Wellington had said something to the effect that it was either him or Drake that their defeat of either Napoleon or the Spanish Armada was achieved based on the football they used to play. So it's probably Wellington, and like yeah, because they saw that as training for war. Hunting. So there's a lot of hunting pictures. Yeah, hunting is also training for war. The Mongols used to engage in the Great Hunt, where they would do two things. It would kill a lot of animals so they could eat them, but it would also, the way the hunt would work though, it was like a military operation, and they would use the same methods and techniques and training that they would later on use against other people on these animals. So a lot of these things that the left historians will like to say, or left anthropologists will say as well, yeah, these are not actually warfare images. Well, yeah, but you don't have to, because hunting and sports and a lot of these things throughout global societies are seen as a sort of at least training for war.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other problems with this whole analysis of warfare and prehistory is that, as we stated before, it's been entirely politicized. And this is an interesting dichotomy between the study of archaeology and history, where prehistory, due to the lack of records, is just entirely shrouded in mystery. and therefore we're at the mercy of the interpreter, and really, their interpretation of patterns of physical evidence. And when a really nebulous and difficult topic of studying an ancient culture comes about, well, sometimes you have total shit shows like Margaret Mead, who ended up being, full of shit and ended up, lying or being lied to, and tried to. I mean, basically what you said earlier, that the tribesmen that she was speaking with were basically giving them everything she wanted to hear, and it wasn't later until Freeman went over the evidence and debunked a lot of Mead's findings. So yeah, that's kind of it's an unfortunate aspect of archaeology and prehistory that has just been so deeply politicized. Yeah.
Yeah, the other one of the seminal works that sort of breaks down this idea of prehistoric peace is Lawrence Keeley's War Before Civilization. And I think for our purposes, the two interesting things from the book are that what we call total war, in the modern age, we say maybe begins with, uh, the French occupation of Spain and the Napoleonic Wars with guerrilla warfare. Maybe we want to pinpoint it with the American Civil War, or maybe we want to pinpoint it with World War One. Regardless, whatever. The what makes total war is that it fails to make a distinction between civilian or non-combatants and combatants as legitimate targets for military hardware. And he points out that in these ancient Stone Age civilizations and Stone Age societies, there really isn't any distinction made between adult or child, or sex, or profession. They just kill you. There's literally no distinction being made here, unless they need to for purposes of kidnapping. I mean, they want to kidnap you for various reasons, in which case they might pay attention to your sex and your age and your station. And the other thing is how effectively they could mobilize their adult manpower population. So with a lot of these war bands that he looks into, they are able to mobilize a very high proportion of their male population. In fact, because many of these tribes are essentially geared towards war out of the gate. Whereas, in more sedentary societies with the division of labor, a lot of the population cannot really be devoted to fighting, because you wouldn't be able to do all the other stuff like agriculture and governance and everything else that you would have to do. So they could mobilize larger portions. And we see this too with sedentary nomadic peoples in Asia, like the Turks and the Mongols. They didn't live in cities. They didn't have all this bureaucracy, and they could mobilize a very large amount of their male population to go off and conquer the world, so to speak. And these wars were extremely decisive. There was an account where there were these two Indian tribes he was discussing, and they just killed a quarter of the male population of this one tribe, and it just died out. Like, you just got it incorporated into one of the neighboring tribes, because you essentially eliminated so much of its male population that it was done. It was over. So it was very decisive and brutal. And so a lot of the niceties of war that we bemoan the loss of in the 20th and 21st centuries didn't even exist in the minds of the people fighting, let alone anywhere else in the Stone Age.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, with the book War Before Civilization, Robert Carnero, in his coercive theory, would discuss periods of intense fighting and then periods of stagnant rebuilding, or stagnation and rebuilding, where there was no discernment made between women or children or priests or certain types of skilled craftsmen. It was just taking a one giant paint stroke approach as far as warfare goes. But then after a one warring band defeats another one, or defeats a sedentary peoples, well, there's essentially this long rebuilding period where there would be no war, but it's not because it's not the but it would be because there's no ability to wage war because everything's been ransacked and reduced to such little material that warfare is not even an option. So he did discuss that in his coercive theory. In addition to that, again, with the ubiquity of these really important weapons like the spear, the sling, the bow, and the atlatl, uh, there were some cultures that would, the spear was believed to be used first for hunting, and that is largely true. But again, there was there's no question that it was used for war around its time of development for hunting. So again, this is just chips away at the idea that somehow prehistory was some peaceful epoch in history.
Exactly. Now, when we look at Stone Age warfare, like what there were really one of three reasons, or one of three kinds of wars that would be fought. They're what we might call flower wars, and those are wars for captives. That might be sacrificial victims, that might be women, that might be slaves. Whatever that happens to be, you fight a war to gain some form of captive. The second type would be conquest. You fight to control population centers. You fight to gain control over settlements and cities and villages and whatnot. And then thirdly, we see warfare going to the point of extermination, where these long-standing disputes and violent altercations get to the point where whatever limits may or may not have been imposed upon the conflict are removed. And we see with the ancient Maya, Stone Age peoples and Stone Age civilization, we see that trajectory. The early warfare tends to be more oriented towards captives for victims, and so the weapons tend to be more blunt, so you can break a bone or knock someone out, then take them away. And then when you become more interested in lethality, you see a transition to more sharp-edged or piercing type weapons. And then, of course, the collapse of the classic Maya civilization, which is roughly 200 to 800 AD, is the result of wars of extermination, where they literally undermined the land that they were living on to the extent that they couldn't live on it anymore, and they died, mainly by poisoning water sources. And so this is where the Native Americans, and especially in Mesoamerica, give us sort of like, this is the sort of theoretical system that I'm using, is that the warfare as described by the Spanish in the 16th century of Mexican and Peruvian Indians is, I think, a useful rubric for understanding Stone Age warfare throughout the Old World as well. In the Old World, we don't have any written accounts of Stone Age warfare. So we do have accounts because of the Spanish and other Europeans in the New World. And given that this Stone Age period was one of general stagnation, it's not likely that even though they developed in isolation, the modes and methods of Native American warfare were qualitatively different than warfare in the Old World at the time. So, I wonder some of your thoughts on that.
Sure. I don't think there's any reason to think that the ancient warfare that was conducted in Mesoamerica could have been that much different from the Old World. The only variations that I think you'll see are in the formations of population centers. For example, as you mentioned earlier, it's believed that Jericho is the first settlement with that was a walled settlement. And again, I mean, why else do you think walls were formed? Well, it was to keep invaders out. And interestingly enough, it's believed that Jericho was formed first as a hunting site. This is pre-farming, of course, and then later it did turn into an agricultural site where the farmers could live within the walled structure, and then they could farm during the day with relative peace. And there's another site in modern day Turkey called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's like Katalahoyuk or something like that, where it wasn't a walled city, but all of the structures, each room shared a doorway into the next room. And so what would end up happening is if an invading force made it to the settlement, they would break into a room. They'd find themselves in one room, and they'd be more or less be forced to bottleneck their way through to the next room. So giving the defenders some sort of edge there, and also they'd deprive the invaders of using ladders to get up on top of the structures themselves. So, yes, I don't think there's that much difference, and that's why it's been really helpful that the Jesuits of Europe did a good job of capturing a lot of the history of Mesoamerica, and I think that it is a really helpful window into the past. When you were talking earlier about the three different variations of warfare, such as warfare for captives, conquest, and extermination, I think one interesting example is the conquest of Tikal, and that was I think that was in 378, and that was by the warlord Shia Konk, or Shia Konk. You'll have to bear with me there on the pronunciation, but where he came in and they killed the king, and he basically made himself the ruler there. That was more or less used. Some of the captives there were used as sacrificial offerings, but it's not like the entire city was used for just that purpose. So it's kind of a mixed bag of motivations for warfare sometimes in Mesoamerica.
Yeah, exactly. And we we also see that once we've defined what war is, once we've sort of looked at its earliest formations in the Stone Age, there are really three kinds of what you might call weapon systems in warfare. There are those that are primarily used for hunting. So that would be the spear, the bow, the atlatl, and the sling, which I think all four of those have been found on every continent except Antarctica, because everybody's got to eat red meat, and that's how you're going to get it. And you see, this is why when liberal archaeologists and historians point to hunting motifs and argue that's not warlike, well, of course it is, because the first weapons of war are weapons of hunting, and that makes absolute sense, because if you're going to hunt animals, it's not too much of a stretch to hunt humans. For example, in Europe, when the European armies in the 18th century started rolling out specialized marksmen, they would all name them by their nation's word for hunter. So for the Germans, they were called Jaegers, uh, and in the United States and in the Americas, they're called Rangers. And so, the idea was you had trained marksmen. Well, most of your trained marksmen are going to be hunters, and you just name them hunters. I mean, that's that's a pretty direct connection right there. The
Yeah.
second kind of weapons are what you might call non-violent in their normal use. So for hunting, you're trying to kill another animal. So those are weapons, or those are tools that are lethal by intent. There are tools that can be turned into weapons of war that are not lethal by intent. So an axe is meant to cut down trees. A hoe, a pick, a bill, and a flail are meant for farming, agriculture, art, construction. But all of those can also be turned into weapons. And then lastly, there are those weapons that are specifically made for only one purpose, to be a weapon, what we might call specialized weapons. And we see, especially with the pictographs of these Stone Age societies with swords and clubs and maces, uh, the reason why these images cannot just be images that have no relation to war and are just symbolic is because the weapons that the chief or the king is using are only war weapons. They have no other non-military use by intent. And we also see in the Americas this same sort of trajectory, this same sort of projection from weapons that are tools that are meant to be lethal with regards to animals being turned against humans, tools that are not meant to be lethal but later turned against humans, like say the axe, We don't see as much of the other more traditional farming type tools like bills and flails and scythes, because a lot of Mesoamerican societies were pre-agricultural, and those that were agricultural, like the Incas and the Aztecs, had extremely innovative and given the technological limitations, innovative farming techniques that didn't really rely on those tools that we might find in Europe or Asia. And then lastly, these specialized weapons like the war club, which would be the Native American equivalent of a sword, um, and the mace or anything like that. So, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting to see the development of specialized weapons, especially in Mesoamerica, and I forget what it's called. It's kind of like colloquially known as the like war club, I think, isn't it, in the Mayan civilization,
Yeah.
with obsidian on both opposing sides of the club. It's both used as like a blunt weapon on the flat side with the wood, and then obsidian, which is, you know, crazy sharp. It's like a molecule thin or something like that. So that is a really unique region specific weapon that is fairly fascinating. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There is sort of this overlap area where you've got tools that are used both as hunting and self-defense, but as well as, uh, construction and farming and art and so on and so forth. So again, yeah, this kind of this more 20th, 19th, and 20th century idea that hunting wasn't violent or not even warlike because it just had more to do with some weird euphemism like cultural preservation. Well, yeah, it is. You had to this is how you live back then. So yeah, there's no reason to think that there wasn't some easy transition between hunting and then from there tribal warfare or something like that. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's interesting to see how the evolution of tools from, you could say, Asia Minor and the Old World compared to Mesoamerica, just simply due to what's available in those areas environmentally. Again, the Egyptians later on, although they're not necessarily part of this video, I mean, a lot of their tools and weapons ended up being copper, whereas other cultures just simply didn't have that available to them, depending on their location in the world. So, again, because of the scarcity of that entire epoch, that would you're either blessed by that or you're damned by it, just depending on where you are. And I think that's, again, I don't want to go too far in the Jared Diamond direction of environmental determinism, but it definitely has some relevancy as far as warfare and state formation are concerned in this subject, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think probably the main disanalogy between warfare in the New World and warfare in the Old World is that when we look at the Spanish reports, we are dealing with sophisticated urban civilizations, whereas by the time they developed in the Old World, they had moved out of the Stone Age. They had moved into the Bronze, and the Iron Age. So having sophisticated urban populations does change some of the dynamics, but I think fundamentally though, uh, that's not enough of a detracting factor to avoid looking at New World warfare as reported by the Europeans, and I think that's where we'll go next. Now, if we look at the New World, there are three kinds of populations. There are nomadic, semi-nomadic, and sedentary populations. We think of Indians with horses, but they only got horses after the Spanish, so they're not really. We're not going to really talk about those kind of Indians yet. But what we see with these kinds of Indians is that if you were nomadic or semi-nomadic, you tended to fight. Imagine like the Scythians and the Parthians shot, hit and run, but without horses. That's sort of what they did. You can look at accounts of America, of English and French settlers fighting Indians, and they'll just kind of like jump out at you and fire a bunch of arrows and darts, and then melt back into the forest. Um, they tended to use missile weapons like darts, blowguns, atlatls, bows, and slings to soften up a target for an attack. And oftentimes, again, lethality wasn't really the goal. The goal was to capture captives. And so they weren't necessarily, quote, maximum lethality, unquote, like you would find in the old world. But you do find some weapons that are quite lethal as it develops. And then the sedentary populations, the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca, develop more sophisticated formations and sophisticated strategies. What I think is the most relevant part right now, though, is that Stone Age warfare, at least in North America and South America, and presumably in Old World Europe, did not lend itself to tight, compact formations. They tended to fight in a loose order. So, for example, the Spanish accounts describe how, even though they maybe only had at most 200 mounted men, they were extremely effective against Indian forces. We do know that the Indians fought with spears, some of them did, but we know it wasn't in mass formations because, for example, in the old world, if you had a shield wall or a pike block and you just ran horses in there, you'd have a bunch of shish kebab horses. And you just wouldn't do that. You just wouldn't use those tactics in Europe. But in the New World, Cortez felt confident to do so, and it was extremely effective. So that tells me that Native American forces, even when they had large armies like the Aztecs and the Inca, did not fight in close order. They fought in loose order. And so it would seem that the basic trend is harass the enemy or surround the enemy if you have a large army like the Aztecs, and then weaken their resolve and their unit strength by missile weapons. And then after that, go in for the kill. Now, in North America, a lot of the Native Americans didn't really go in for a melee, where they'd go in, hand to hand. They would prefer, they would do what they called counting coup. They try to run up and touch you and run away. Because if you could touch a violent man who had the ability to kill you, but then he didn't kill you, that meant that you were the superior warrior. But yeah, I know it's funny, right? But then when you look with the Aztecs and the Inca, though, they do get up close and personal. They do knock your brains out. They do cut your head off. And for that, they have war clubs and stone axes. But that, I would argue, is the rough contours of what Stone Age warfare would have been like in the old world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like you've laid out sort of two branches of tactics between different types of peoples. You have the nomadic and the semi-nomadic, where they really rely on things like a well-calculated ambush, or using, I can't remember what strategist said this, but it was, using the tactics of deterrence, ambushing places like highways and roadways and aqueducts and things like that. It's typically at high speed, at very small scale, like almost like a squad size type of formations, and sometimes ended up being very brutal. Again, this is more of along the lines of Mayan tactics, but people of sedentary nature are in the entire opposite, where they are capable of fielding more advanced formations, the capacity to maintain something like a siege or a tactical approach and to against a settlement, and the speed is slower, it's more protracted because they have the logistics to do that sort of thing. So yes, when the Europeans did finally land, as we were talking about earlier, I think Cortez only had around 100 men mounted on horses, but due to how new they were to the Mesoamericans, I mean, they were able to rout thousands of them. Jared Diamond even admits this, just simply due to a combined arms approach of some gunpowder, advanced infantry formations on foot, and then flanking and pincer maneuvers by cavalry. So not only did they not stand a chance, but they're like operating on two completely different levels just in terms of warfare. There's no way that these ambush, like hit and run tactics, are going to be able to do anything against these large formations of advanced forces. There's just there's no way. It's no wonder that was the outcome for Cortez and for the Aztecs.
Yes, the one of the other things too that we see as a distinction between these kinds of Indians is if you are engaging in a sort of hit and run style like these either North American forest Indians or South American jungle Indians, like say the Tupi or the Caribbean Indians, they have no ability to take cities, so they're extremely limited in their power projection potential, PP, or triple P, power projection potential, and they just don't really. Um, Now in North America, that changed a little bit with the advent of the horse, but again, we're not really dealing with horses in this context because we want to try to get an idea of what Stone Age warfare would have looked like, even in the old world, and we have to look at how they fought before they sort of were informed by European modes and tools. Now, the other thing is with these mass sedentary populations, you now have the ability to take cities. Now, siege warfare in ancient America was extremely simple. It was essentially storm. The Incas and the Aztecs could marshal such an obscene amount of manpower, armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, that they could just storm settlements, and they might lose 20, 30,000 people, but what's it to them? They don't care. Um, and their opponents are not likely to be able to effectively deal with that because they're just at best a city, just a single city or a collection of cities, and they wouldn't really be able to do that. So Stone Age warfare, when it comes to sieges, is going to essentially be storm. That might mean ladders. That might mean earthen ramparts. And the idea with the storm is you want to attack from multiple directions at once, such that you overload the capacity of the defenders on the wall to deal with you. So, given the size of a city, there's only X number of soldiers at intervals that can be placed there. And if you attack from multiple vectors with enough troops on each of those vectors, you just overwhelm the defenders, and they can't really do anything. Or or the other way they would deal with cities would be through sieges. Just wait them out, cut them off from supply, and starve them out. A lot of these empires, like the Inca and the Aztecs, had the means to sustain long-term operations, uh, and so they could besiege a city and wear it out that way. That would be another method, and that's in part why these empires were able to grow to such size relative to other Stone Age neighbors that they had. So, what's some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. The storming tactics were pretty fascinating because again, the idea of a walled settlement wasn't something that wasn't ubiquitous at the time. There were some settlements that just arose organically without walls, where in they may not have had to deal with that much conflict, whereas some place like Jericho that was probably facing invaders all the time were simply forced to do it from the beginning. So yeah, like you said, siege equipment at that point would have been extremely simple. I don't think there was anything like a siege tower probably until at least a practical siege tower until probably the early Middle Ages. I think it could be argued. At least there's that's when there's good evidence for that sort of thing. As well as ramparts would have been used as well. But again, I think you're right. The storming tactics would have been used. One thing that's interesting too is that as we've talked about in our private conversations, is that these Mesoamerican civilizations, they would end up being so brutal towards their adjacent autonomous farming communities, just to use them as basically sacrificial cattle, that I think that's one of the reasons why those powers ended up failing. Because again, if you're sacrificing people, and you're abducting them outside of your state for generation after generation, well, of course that's going to create some insane levels of animosity. So I don't know why. Yeah, I don't think you could argue that that's not a part of the reason for why those powers failed. And yeah, I think that ancient tactics are really fascinating in the sense that you either have this nomadic ambush approach, or you have more European esque sort of advanced formations and combined arms tactics. So yeah, two very different worlds.
Yeah, and when you look at the Aztecs, well, they certainly used missile weapons of their own. They did sort of focus in on and perfect the more hand to hand combat with the war club. Spanish accounts say that a Aztec war club could cut a man and horse in half. So it was definitely a fearsome weapon to go up against. And as I said, with spears, these are more to be understood as having been fought in more of an individualized style. We do tend to see that too as well, more of the individual style combat. So like in the Middle Ages, when you see like, or even like in antiquity with like David and Goliath, champions calling each other out for a fight, or fighting somebody on the other side for honor. We do tend to see more of a focus on this sort of individual aspect of fighting. You know, I'm the prince of this city, and I'm going to fight you, and we're going to try to capture each other or something. Rather than mass, we don't really find organized mass formations. We don't find phalanxes or shield walls or legions. None of these organized, sophisticated formations. Because when we look at the actual accounts of native warfare, they're just not capable of doing the kinds of things that one would expect them to be able to do if they did have such formations. So, like, the fact that an army of 80,000 Aztecs could not stop Cortez's mounted soldiers demonstrates that they just weren't using spears very effectively. If this had been in the old world at the time, yeah, Cortez would have been chum. So I think loose order combat more geared towards individual chief champions fighting each other.
Yeah, well, you could say that, it wasn't like their poor use of spears, but just a poor use of tactics. Again, I don't think there was any conception in Aztec culture of like advanced pincer moves or, or some sort of like the idea of reserves. Again, I don't think, I doubt that culture had some conception of that where, oh, well, let's reserve, you know, 50,000 men behind our lines and see what we can do with 30,000, first, and let's spread it out in this sort of way, and let's have these types of troops placed here and these types of troops placed there, and so on and so forth. I think they were just this quasi-Soviet storm them until they run out of ammunition, or storm them until they run out of their own tricks, basically, and that just did not work out for them, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the other limitations on Stone Age warfare is the issue of lethality, and this is probably why the Aztecs and the Inca and the Maya were more interested in captives than actual just like slaughtering a whole bunch of guys on the battlefield to then take advantage of that strategically. So, well, okay, let me explain what I mean by lethality here. We just said that Stone Age warfare was very lethal. Lots of people were killed. Yes, it was lethal in the sense that when violence was applied indiscriminately. But when we speak of the lethality of a weapon system, we mean, okay, per unit, how lethal is that weapon system? How much damage can it inflict? And Stone Age weapons are not that lethal compared to other metals. So that's ultimately why in the old world we went from stone to bronze to iron and steel, because the lethality just scales. I mean, you might have a stone, a spear with a stone tip, like the Mexicans used obsidian. Okay, that'll cut you up pretty good. But stone is brittle and can break and fracture. Um, when we get to bronze is malleable, which it doesn't break as easily as stone would. Iron is both malleable and tough. It's hard. You won't shatter. So and that of course limits tactics and weapons. because if you don't have these kinds of increasingly lethal systems, you don't have, armor even. If you look at like the Aztec armor, it was cotton, it was very soft, because they're dealing with a lot of missile weapons, darts, arrowheads, slingstones. And since you're only going to get hit by another piece of stone, there wasn't really any need to have anything more robust. And of course, stone it deals more, to use RPG language, crush damage. It doesn't so much deal pierce or slash damage. So you want to, when you're dealing with crush damage, you want to diffuse it over a wide area. That's why you invent pierce damage to bring all the energy to a single point. But of course, spearheads and arrowheads are brittle. They're made out of stone. Whereas in the old world, you had metal armor. And you can't really use stone as armor because it's too heavy. And you can't really shape it into something that you need. I guess you could use bone, but bone is, also very likely to shatter upon impact. So there are just hard caps on the evolution of warfare when you're limited to the Stone Age.
Yeah, absolutely. You are limiting yourself to only a small handful of effective weapons and only used in a certain capacity. And it's kind of interesting, like the Mayan cotton armor, they were really, they were almost described as like looking like porcupines because they had so many arrows stuck in their armor after battle, but the guy was still alive. But, versus some steel weapon, well, you're totally out of luck. Yeah, again, there is this tiny window of effective weapons that you could make. The best that you could do is being part of a group that has a variety of weapons and a variety of physical skills. Again, that might be stone weapons as well as like projectile weapons, and that's about as good as it gets, really, unfortunately. Yeah, I think we're probably getting close to closing statements, and I'll probably just summarize by saying that it's prehistoric warfare is really fascinating. It's just unfortunate that it's so shrouded in mystery just due to the lack of records. And on top of that, it's unfortunate that many people that study it are so heavily politicized from the cultural left that you're almost guaranteed to being lied to or being fed a certain narrative that's just skewed so far towards some liberal classical sense of brotherly love and this or that, and that's just clearly not the case. Even if you go back as far as like Homo habilis skulls, the Homo sapiens are dated somewhere around 250,000 years old, roughly speaking, give or take 100 or so thousand years. But even Homo habilis skulls, I've been found to, many of them to have puncture wounds and crushing blow wounds and so on and so forth. I think you can make a distinction between the Paleolithic era being slightly more peaceful because there, especially during that whole epoch, there was basically no sense of land ownership or territorial ownership or even central planning. But again, we're really splitting hairs here because when Neolithic people, when people became more sedentary, of course, those ideas became more clear, and things were, I don't want to say things were always violent, but the ubiquity of violence is self-evident at this point. And yeah, but it is fascinating. It's an important part of history, and I think we really do need a group of people. We just probably need more nonpartisan, non-politicized people who are interested in archaeology to really give it a fair analysis.
Yeah, exactly. I think what I would end with is if we look at the styles of warfare of Stone Age America, especially in light of the culture shock with Spanish, the semi-nomadic and nomadic tribes who pursued a policy of raiding and skirmishing and avoided mass formations had in some sense the superior style, because the Yucatan, the homeland of the Mayas, took the Spanish 150 years to subjugate, whereas the Inca and Aztec empires collapsed within a decade. This was very much harder for them to do. And even as they went north into the American Southwest, uh, ultimately, yes, the Comanche did receive horses, though not immediately. The semi-nomadic tribes, especially the Comanche, were never conquered by the Spanish. So it does seem that if you are going to fight with Stone Age weapons, and you are going to have to fight with, people using guns, even the best way to go would be to do this indirect skirmishing, hit and run, uh, raiding style of combat, because it tends to play to the strengths of Stone Age weapons, which is the ability to harass and inflict minor wounds that, I mean, they won't take the guy out, but it can definitely slow the other guy down, because now you gotta take care of a sick guy or a wounded guy. And so, yeah, but ultimately, warfare is mass organized premeditated violence for a political purpose. The Stone Age was extremely violent, and stone weapons put a hard cap on what you can do with the evolution of the art of war. And I'd like to thank Terminal Philosophy for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's been great.
This is Todd Lewis of the President's Folly Podcast, signing off.